Again, thank you very much to everybody that has already made it to their seats and are watching us live. We're going to give it just another moment for everybody to get settled in, and then we'll begin our conversation. So I will trail through the introductions to allow people to get settled. My name is Lee Theodore, project coordinator for this project called Future Climate Leaders. It is presented to you by the St. Lawrence River Institute, and it is funded in part by the Government of Canada. And so the objective of these town hall conversations is to gather a community around conversations and be able to take insightful bits of information back into their lives to consider as far as their climate change journey. So this evening, we have a wonderful conversation titled Home and Abroad, Indigenous Knowledge and Climate Change Adaptations. So there are going to be two main themes that are going to be discussed: Indigenous knowledge systems and traditional ecological knowledge. Now, the definitions themselves, please do not let the words kind of trip you up. It's very important that we all understand that we have a purpose and a role to play in climate change solutions. So if we were to look at studying old cultures from almost an anthropological sense, if we were able to look back in time and see what the common person is able to understand about their environment, the tools that they'd be using to interact with their environment, and us here in this present sense being able to look back and say, what was their relationship, what did they know, and what is it that we can pull from that kind of perspective. So at this point in time, I do feel that people are gathered here in their seats today. So we're going to begin our town hall. So again, my name is Lee Theodore. Welcome to this town hall, Home and Abroad. My friend, today we have joining us Abraham Francis from the Mohawk Council of Akwesasne, and we've got Yannick Roson joining us from the St. Lawrence River Institute. I'm very grateful for both. Both possess important pieces of knowledge around Indigenous knowledge systems, and I welcome them here today. I'm going to allow Yannick to start off the conversation by providing us with a very great introduction piece, but also a little insight into Fijian Indigenous knowledge systems. And then from there, we're going to allow Abraham to provide us with a local perspective. And so what is the difference between Fijian experiences and Mohawk experiences? And what is it that we could learn as individuals from these cultures? So other than that, I thank you very much, Yannick Roson. I allow the floor to be yours, and please begin our conversation today.
Thanks, Lee. So I'll just start by sharing my screen with everyone. All right, does that look all right? Perfect. Okay, well, thanks, Lee, for that introduction. So my name is Yannick Roson, and I prepared a short presentation today on climate change adaptation and traditional ecological knowledge systems in Fiji. Just trying to figure out how to switch the slides, so sorry. All right, so sorry. All right, there it is. All right, so a quick recap of my presentation. So I'll start off by introducing myself, followed by providing some background information on Fiji and how it is currently being impacted by climate change. Then looking at the project I was working on, how traditional ecological knowledge was present within this project, and finally, how this relates back to us here in Canada, and a few key takeaways. So about me, I am a graduate from the University of Guelph. I completed my undergraduate degree in international development studies. And in 2019, I conducted an internship in Fiji with a local non-for-profit called Live and Learn. And I was working on a UN Habitat project called Fiji Resilient Informal Settlements Project. And now I work for the St. Lawrence River Institute as a research assistant on the Great River Report, as well as on the Future Climate Leaders Project. So how is climate change impacting Fiji? So first, to provide a little bit of context, on the left-hand side of this map is where I am currently located. So on the traditional Haudenosaunee territories of the Haudenosaunee. And on the right-hand side of the map is the South Pacific Island region, so Fiji. And on right to the left-hand side of Fiji is Australia. So the closest landmass over here is Australia. So the country is experiencing a wide variety of climate change impacts, including landslides, droughts, hurricanes, sea level rising, among many others. And Fiji now gets hit with about one hurricane, like massive hurricane every year, which causes mass destruction. And so these have increased in both severity and frequency as a result of climate change. So on February 19th, I was actually out doing field work when I took this photo of this landmass to the left. And when I returned to do field work a month later, I actually noticed that a landslide had occurred. And what you can't see in the photo is that behind the trees over here, there was actually a farmer's field. And so his crops were impacted pretty significantly by the landslide. And the fact that I was able to capture this photo just purely out of luck, I think really just speaks to the frequency of these climate impacts. So the project I worked on was called Fiji Resilient Informal Settlements Project. And before delving into the project specifics, I'd like to start off by giving a brief definition of what are informal settlements, as they often have a lot of different names. So sometimes these are called slums, informal dwellings, shanty towns. In Brazil, they're even called favelas. But essentially, these are places where inhabitants don't have legal land tenure to the lands on which they're living. And so that this means that they're living outside of city governance systems. So they often don't have access to basic services like water, electricity, waste disposal. And as they don't have legal land tenure and legally protected rights to the land, their houses are rarely built up to safe building codes. And so there's the constant threat that the government will be removing them from the land. It's also important to keep in mind that these populations often represent the poorest in society. So these are some photos I took during my time of informal settlement communities. So the one on the left-hand side was located in a town called, a community called California, which is a pretty funny name for the community. And as you can see, it's made with bits and pieces of very mismatched materials, and it would not be able to provide a lot of protection against flooding or extreme weather events. And this house on the right-hand side, this informal settlement, was in the community of Nakiroso. And this one is built a little bit better. And so I chose these two photos to sort of display how housing infrastructure varies pretty significantly from one informal settlement to the next and from one community to another. So the most prominent climate change impact experienced by a lot of these communities is flooding. So the photo on the right-hand side was taken approximately 50 minutes after some relatively very light rainfall. But as these settlements are informal, this means that they often occupy the least desirable land, and so they are often situated in floodplains. So you can see that it's already starting to flood on the property. And the photo on the left-hand side is of a raised community shelter. And that little red star is just to indicate just how high the water levels tend to rise. And you can see that it's actually above the height of the cart. And so often during mass rainfall or extreme weather events, hurricanes, water levels are rising above community members' homes. And so they're having to take refuge in these raised community shelters. So the aim of this project was to increase the resilience of informal settlement communities to climate change impacts. And the project involved 4 main stages delivered over the course of 5 years. So the first stage is to conduct a vulnerability assessment in all 16 communities to try and really just quantify how vulnerable these informal settlement communities are to climate impacts. So this took into account many factors, such as what percentage of the population is currently employed, how many people have running water, how safe is their housing infrastructure, among many other things. The second part of the project was to identify strengths within these communities and then to produce action plans on how these strengths can be utilized to increase resiliency. So for example, if a lot of individuals in the communities were carpenters, then perhaps implementing a series of workshops in which learning how to raise houses would have been a really great and effective use of resources. And finally, the last 2 stages of the project are to actually implement the action plans and then raise awareness of what was done and how effective these strategies have been. So what was the role of traditional ecological knowledge within this project? So I'd like to start by just defining traditional ecological knowledge. There are a lot of existing definitions. However, what's most important to maybe remember is that traditional ecological knowledge is very context specific, and the actual knowledge itself is very unique to each community which engages with it. And so this is true not just within Fiji, but throughout the world as well. But traditional ecological knowledge can roughly be defined as a set of knowledge or practices that have been acquired through observations and experiences and which have been passed down from generation to generation, and they refer specifically to the relationship between living beings and their local environment. And throughout this presentation, I'll be providing some examples of Fijian traditional ecological knowledge. So as part of the project, I was able to visit many different informal settlement communities and partake in some community town hall sessions. And these meetings allowed participating groups to share what they believed were the most pressing climate change impacts affecting their communities and insight as to how they thought that these climate impacts could be addressed. And what we came to find was that a lot of the times these proposed solutions were grounded in traditional knowledge. So for example, in responding to sea level rising, a lot of community members recommended the planting of mangroves. So this is a plant which is native to Fiji, and the photo on the left over here is a photo of the mangrove plant. And as you can see, it has very extensive root systems. And so it's very efficient, effective in preventing erosion and in regulating water levels. The mangrove plant also has a lot of cultural significance. And so the plant is used at times in making Fijian masi cloths, which you can see in the photo here. And it's to create the dye for the masi cloths themselves. And then the photo on the right-hand side, I included because it's got a pretty great story behind it. So one of the communities that we visited after the United Nations had gone in and consulted the community for the first time, this community in particular was really suffering from erosion and sea level rising. And so one community member decided to go out and start planting mangroves right away to address the issue. And he actually was able to rally up quite a lot of the community members, and he got everyone behind him and planting mangroves along the shoreline. And so when we came back a few months later, for the town hall meeting, we saw that mangroves had already begun to be planted. And this is just a really great example of the fact that a lot of these community members in the past were often regarded as very passive agents to the things that were happening to them, but they're not. A lot of these people are knowledge holders, and they're very aware of environmental issues impacting them and how these environmental issues can be addressed. And so it's really important that they're included in these conversations and in these initiatives. So another example of traditional ecological knowledge in Fiji was these bures. So these were the predominant form of housing in Fiji prior to the country being colonized in 1874 by British settlers. So bures are actually made up of wood and sometimes even mangroves. And the housing infrastructure was actually built to withstand extreme weather events. But now housing in Fiji, so post-colonization, housing in Fiji is comprised of very modern forms of housing using materials such as metal roofing or tin roofing, and which are significantly less able to withstand climate impacts such as extreme weather storms or hurricanes. So one last example. So what constitutes regular or irregular behavior of seabirds is knowledge which has been passed down from generation to generation through observations. And so when the behavior of certain seabird changes in a very specific way, it can be indicative that a hurricane is approaching. The same is true for fruiting and flowering of certain plants. So if mass fruiting of mangoes happens at a very specific time of year, this can be indicative that there's a hurricane approaching. And in response to these signs, oftentimes Fijians will cut down the tops of root plants. And so this prevents them from being actually ripped out of the ground. And so, during extreme weather events, rather than losing their crops, they're able to protect them. So these are two examples of ways in which traditional knowledge can help both predict and also prevent harm from weather events, which are occurring more frequently as a result of climate change. So as we can see in the three examples provided, traditional ecological knowledge remains quite prominent in a lot of Fijian communities and even in the formal ones. So after conducting my internship, I became really interested in better understanding the ways in which traditional knowledge is recognized and implemented in the actual action plans of these projects. So really understanding how much is it really being integrated into solutions. What I came to find was that in conducting vulnerability assessments, traditional ecological knowledge is recognized as an asset, meaning that a community which holds and engages a lot with traditional knowledge and practices is deemed as being less vulnerable to climate change impacts. But yet there's actually very little research on the ways in which traditional knowledge is actually implemented in the action plans created. What this means is that community members are said to be included in these projects, and that's fantastic, but we don't really know to what degree their voices are actually being heard and listened to and integrated in project outcomes. So things such as, mangroves and bures and seabird behaviors, these are part of the conversations happening, and that's fantastic. But we want to know, are they really part of the project plans? And this, of course, this research and all of this information, it extends beyond the borders of Fiji. And this is true for many communities with Indigenous knowledge throughout the world. So what is the relevance of this project to Canada? So why a presentation on Fiji? So in 2017, Fiji contributed less than 0.006% to global carbon emissions. And this percentage actually accounts for population density. And then in the same year, Canada contributed 1.60% to global carbon dioxide emissions. And so this means that on average, every Canadian produces 2.6 times more carbon dioxide than the average Fijian. And so despite the fact that Fiji contributes very little to global emissions, they're nonetheless being very severely impacted by climate change. So climate change is, of course, occurring throughout the world, and that is impacting every region in very unique ways. In the case of Fiji, as with many other regions in the world, traditional knowledge may present the opportunity to inform current practices and how we go about adapting to climate change. So our region in particular is facing various different climate change impacts, including changes to the levels and temperatures of the St. Lawrence River. And so it's important to reflect on these changes and to make sure that we're really asking ourselves, who's being included in these conversations, what conversations are happening, and, who has a seat at the table, and are their voices really being heard? So I could just leave everyone with just two key takeaways from my experience. It would just be that what we do in our everyday here really does have a big importance, and we might not be able to directly see what these impacts are, but they might be trickling out and having implications throughout the world in ways that we can't really see, but it is important. And so it's important to reflect on our choices and really question, how could we make these improvements in our everyday? And then the second point that I really took away from my experience was that in addressing an issue as significant as climate change, it's integral to really look around and ensure that everyone is sitting at the table and not only able to speak, but to really be heard in these conversations. And if we want to do so, we need, good partnerships and relationships and transparency. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Yannick. That was very informative. And before I pass this on to Abe, if you can just help us out one more time and just give us a definition of Indigenous knowledge systems or traditional ecological knowledge, just so that we can carry this into the next part of our conversation as well.
Yeah, so there are a lot of, I don't want to say existing definitions, but traditional knowledge is very unique to every place. And so it would be, it could be defined as observations and knowledge and practices acquired through observations over time. And it's a set of, these are passed down from generation to generation, whether it's in writing or verbally, and it refers specifically to humans' relationships to the natural environment.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Yannick, for this information yet again and that definition. Abraham, the floor is open to you to contribute to this conversation, please.
So, so hi everyone, my name is Abe Francis. I'm taking a little bit of a different approach with my presentation, really focusing on the way that I understand forest stewardship on a global level and then down to the local level, really making a case for the local, but also working with Indigenous communities, and the best practice are some of the lessons I learned from my own research. And then I'm going to have a little conversation about shorelines in Akwesasne and just kind of set some of the framework out here. So give me 2 seconds to, let's see if this works beautifully or not. All right. Everything look good, guys? All right. So really what I've titled this is Approaching Indigenous Knowledge and Climate Change Adaptation. And I wanted to create this presentation to be a bit different from my previous presentation on climate change in Akwesasne, because I did spend a lot of time discussing what climate change looks like in Akwesasne and how we're going to approach that. So I wanted to sort of really add some of the research I've done to this ideas I've brought forward. And so I titled this Approaching Indigenous Knowledge and Climate Change Adaptation. I almost had a moment where I was gonna title it Come Correct. We're working with Indigenous people, but I figured this was probably more on task. And so one of the things I normally do in these conversations is I really like to have a conversation about what is Indigenous? We use this word pretty like interchangeably. We throw it out there often. Indigenous, you hear Aboriginal, you may hear First Nations. There's a lot of different terms thrown out there. And I just want to remind folks that Indigenous is an umbrella term that is used to create community. And when we use Indigenous, that doesn't really capture the context specificity of the locality of which we're engaging. And this is sort of where, for me, the theory, like where this comes from. A little bit of the history around Indigenous and where the use of Indigenous knowledge systems, traditional ecological knowledge, the origins of this, because Indigenous previously was used as a term within literature to talk about Indigenous species. It was really used as an ecological term. And so now that we've shifted it towards the human dimension more so now, or at least from my perspective more so now, or it's more vocal in that way, we need to really be considerate of those shifts in narrative that are occurring. And I like to take a little bit of a moment of pride with the Skahe, who in the 1920s went to the League of Nations to advocate for the rights of the Six Nations after Canada imposed post-Canada imposing councils on us or ban councils on us, and that he was advocating for us. And this would sort of ultimately lead to the creation of the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And there's really beautiful, beautiful stories around this history that even my people here in Akwesasne have to share. Chief Beverly Cook, she was actually a part of the group that went to the United Nations to help start these conversations. And I think she was a transcriber or some. I remember this really beautiful story she shared with us, and it's really great to see how we're so connected on a global level through our Indigenous identity and building this community, but also that we're connected on that, like, it does come down to that local level. And so really Indigenous wasn't used to describe people until the International Labor Organization in the 1957s. And then the Cobo Report, which was actually financed by the United Nations, looked into defining what does Indigenous mean, or how do we just define that? And there were 12 dimensions presented with that. So there was ancestry, culture, language, group consciousness, the multiple criterion, acceptance by Indigenous community, residents in certain parts of the country, and I can keep going on and on here for you, but I won't. But what I love, and one of my biggest inspirations, who has now passed on, her name was Carol Warrior. And I absolutely love her description of Indigenous, and that this conversation about fixity and fluidity, it is up to Indigenous people to define who we are and how we connect with each other. So really important that we acknowledge that our identity is not something to be defined by an external agency. It's something that comes from us and our people, and that we do keep it fluid because colonialism, we've been impacted in such a dramatic way that there's not like, it's not simple. It's not simple to really evaluate us on these multiple criteria that have been developed on us. And so now I kind of walk into this conversation about forest stewardship, because honestly, this is where my understanding of these things really came into view. I reviewed like 5,000 pieces of literature and almost lost my mind, but came up with some really interesting insights. And so in discussing the global context of forest stewardship, and really this is where I draw inspiration for conversations about climate change. I really have a hard time with the United Nations RED program, which is about reducing emissions and forest degradation. And then there's the Forest Stewardship Council. And they have this really beautiful like connection to each other because they're a response to globalization. And I'm not like here to hate on global organizations. I think they're important because of globalization. But they really both grew out of this. In like 1991, there was the Convention of Parties on Biodiversity, and the UN RED program grew out of that like a decade later. But industry didn't want to wait around for bureaucrats to decide that they wanted to do something about forest preservation. And so that's where we get the Forest Stewardship Council. Now, the ways that these different organizations impacted communities often comes down to basically people not doing their homework. But they did have good, and then there was some bad, and it's a hard one to unpack. And so the positive one was for the Perpetua in Nuevo San Juan, Mexico. And they were actually the first ones to become certified by the Forest Stewardship Council and benefited from that system. Unfortunately, this isn't the same for all Indigenous people. The Sami struggled very difficult, like in a very dramatic way, in Sweden and Finland with the Forest Stewardship Council. And so they were just frustrated with the interactions between the forest conservation that was put in place and interfering with the local deer herding, reindeer herders. In Sweden and Finland. And then in like Russia, there was a lack of enforcement around this. And then the certifications were not considered of the national infrastructure and market characteristics. And so the reality was that they were not attentive to that local scale. And I think this sort of may be an inhibition that comes with the global mechanisms that are put in place. And then Larry McDermott, who is a wonderful researcher that I actually get to work with, is that, you know, the FSC claims to have a strong commitment to empowering non-producers through global and regional standards to prevent industry from negatively impacting the environment, Indigenous people's rights, but these don't tend to be reflected in the actual lived reality. And so that's a really, really hard piece to unpack. And another example of a difficult situation that emerged was there was a big conflict between Indigenous communities and the forest industry in Chile. And this story could go on and on and on. And the United Nations Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation program, UN RED, also suffers from similar things. The UN RED disproportionately serves powerful players, and it really raises concerns around protecting Indigenous people and sustainable community development. And that oftentimes Indigenous is mentioned, and that we're going to work with Indigenous people and we're going to make sure that they matter in this conversation, but oftentimes they're not really reflected in practice. And this is where I'm going to consistently make that effort that it is the locale that makes sense. You have to engage with the community, you have to work with them. And that's why I love what Yannick did, is she was in those communities, she talked with these people, she heard them and their concerns around these things. And so we got to move beyond the international debates. We got to, you know, and bring in stuff about social justice, and we need to work together in a really powerful way and do our homework and really bring in and consider that what mechanisms we're putting in place need to be read in context, and that they need to understand politics and history and the environment and ecology, and that these all need to be integrated into that conversation. And so another sort of piece about this is where I sort of looked into the local mechanisms like joint forest management in India, which I thought was really beautiful, you know, working with Indigenous communities and the nation coming together on this. And, you know, and a piece of this I was also like reflecting with Yannick on this was like these informal settlements. These people have no land tenure. And so when India moved towards this joint forest management, what actually didn't happen was there was not a shift of land ownership. There was a recognition of that connection between forest health and the health of forest-dependent indigenous communities, but there was no actual land back. There was no actual ownership. And so the agency in there is somewhat limited. And so there was a comparison that happened between Australia regional forest agreements and these joint forest management structures. And oftentimes there's this reality where there needs to be more work done in that democratic process of addressing issues with public forests and accommodating the needs of indigenous groups through collaborative decision making and distributive outcomes. Now, that sounds all beautiful, but basically just making sure that everybody is treated right. And they were manifested in various ways through NGOs, government, and indigenous participatory strategies or traditional management regimes. And the only thing with joint forest management that really suffered is that they were very much cookie cutter approaches. And if you're going to do a cookie cutter approach, then I'm not interested in that approach, because if you're not going to adjust to local circumstances, then you're not going to be able to really meet the needs of those. And how are we supposed to hold people accountable? And where does the power lie? Where is the decision making? Indigenous people need to be a decision maker. And then I was really into these like community forests, and really because this was like transfer of, in Nepal, they transferred land to villagers to protect and manage. And there was the evidence that was showing that there was actual improvements happening. So land back actually works, y'all. And then in China, government policies changed in the 1960s. And what actually happened was they disrupted the indigenous people's community forest management systems. And what actually showed is that it didn't help preserve biodiversity and affected these people's livelihoods and access to their important medicines. And then in Thailand, the Karen people utilized community forests. But what ended up happening in this situation was that, unfortunately, there's conflict between lowland people and upland people, and Karens are the upland people. And so when this mechanism was put in place, unfortunately, there was this conflict that was developing between the two. And so really, there wasn't the amount of deforestation that lowland people were claiming against the Karen people. And so, like when we put these mechanisms in place, being considerate of those political issues that may arise in those areas. And then in Cambodia, there was just this really, really beautiful assessment of the forests themselves, and really working with policymakers. Like I'm really into model building, I'm really into these like numbers and stuff. And so I really fell in love with the ways that you can look into ways of seeing that impact, or basically telling the future. And this for me, like this was sort of moved into like a payment for ecosystem services, which, in a way I kind of like, I kind of don't like. I mean, we do live in a capitalistic society, which I have issues with, but like money is how we survive. It's a practicality that we live with. If we didn't have to worry about money, imagine the things we could do and accomplish. But money is a part of our lives. And so basically my issue with payment for ecosystem services is it can have an negative impact on local communities, in particular in relationship to food security. And then, if they can't have food security, then they become more dependent on external systems of food, and also they can't hunt. And so there's just these issues of food security that can impact from these sort of putting these different areas aside and preserving them in their beautiful, lack of access, which is a part of a different conversation of like the idea that like pristine, beautiful land is absent from engagement, that like indigenous people can exist there. and there is potential benefits from payment for ecosystem services by shifting people's energy usage away from using those resources. But I mean, this is like the big conversation about model building. It gives us an interesting insight, but it may not always be as accurate as we hope. And so there is the potential for payment for ecosystems to offset, the loss of forestry. And what was a really cool analysis I seen was from Denham in 2017, was that a payment for ecosystem services and an analysis approach that they did was they actually brought in Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination, and that we really need a paradigm shift in thinking about that relationship that Indigenous people have with land. Otherwise, we're going to kind of miss the point. It's not all about money. It's not all about resources and extractions. There's deeper connections that exist there. And so how an Indigenous community describes poverty is different. And we may be considered poor by external agencies, but in actuality, it may be rich in our own respect. And then I really love this concept for agroforestry. And again, it does require a paradigm shift in understanding that Indigenous people, we're not just passively letting land, or we're active managers of these lands and caring for them and building these systems that help support our communities with food security. But again, introducing these Western colonial concepts that don't fit. And we need to center Indigenous people in these conversations of planning, implementation, and reaping the benefits. And there is this really, there's so much potential in agroforestry, of connection, of food security. But it's also a strategy that's very susceptible to climate change. And how are we going to approach that? Certain trees and certain ecosystems are shifting because of climate change and may not be reacting well enough to these changing circumstances. So the impacts on that, I talked more detail in my previous climate change discussion about what it could mean for us, affecting our holistic connection with creation. And so it's just oftentimes we're inviting in these conversations that agroforestry could be this really beautiful solution and helpful piece. And you see this maple here that could potentially do that. But we also have to consider climate change now and the impacts of that on our ability to do that work. And then global capitalism just being very difficult to deal with. That Indigenous people are very successful at protecting land. There's evidence that Indigenous people are successful in protecting and being stewards of the land, and keeping biomass in its place. But we only have control over 5% of the land in the world, and that those lands actually contain 80% of biodiversity. And I find that to be so interesting. And if we have control and we're allowed, and we have the ability to express ourselves on a landscape, I believe there's better ecological outcomes in that relationship. But we also have to understand, globalization, and we want to make sure that communities are benefiting from the system. And I have a lot of issues with ecotourism. I think it's beautiful. I think it can help a community, sharing our cultures, creating awareness, creating community. But it can have really negative impacts on the ecosystem. It can really affect access to medicines. And potentially there's this reality where we may not, the local Indigenous community may not even be benefiting from the system. And this is actually something we have talked quite a bit about. And I think it's a hard one to process. So think about when you're traveling and you want to see different ecosystems, about the impact that you may be having. And, you know, just to kind of give you a little bit, I probably should have brought this more into Canada, but I did my master's in the United States, and I really went through this really interesting political history and how laws affected us in our ability to co-manage, be in engagement with the land. Originally, it was sort of this approach of, I think they call it the Yellowstone model. I may be quoting that incorrectly, but it was basically like, put it aside, don't touch it, leave it alone. And for Indigenous people, like, how are we supposed to be engagement with that land if we can't? But in the 1990s, there was the Indian Forest Resource Management Act, asserting trust responsibilities toward Indian forest lands, tribal self-governance. And, you know, and then in the 1940s, there was the tribal self-governance law, and this supported direct management privilege to tribal governments. And so it's basically putting the control in our hands. And that's where I think it's really important. Land back is a lot about us being able to put our voices forward and to make those things possible. You know, we know these lands. We've been on them for generations. This is our knowledge. I think we can help here. And so, in thinking about collaborations and partnerships, I often talk a lot about this piece is that we need to be more participatory. We need to be understanding that the paradigm is different for Indigenous communities. And one of my favorite examples was actually by Henry Lickers. And he introduced the Eastern Ontario Model Forest that brought together local landowners, values, native philosophies, our people's philosophies, and scientific knowledge. And it was grounded in the foundational principles of the Guyana Lakoa, which are peace, power, and a good mind. And I absolutely love that. And then we've seen a similar situation for the Naruvi, Southern Paiute, who worked with the U.S. Forest Services and in the Spring Mountain landscape. And they introduced these really interesting forest fire regime management strategies that were extremely helpful. And I was just in love with it because this area was just important to their ontology, their spiritual center. It was, and that they weren't even allowed to be involved in it until there was this action only in recent years. And so I'm so appreciative that things are changing and that we are moving forward. It's not to say that like we need to be critical and understand the history of which we come from so we don't repeat those things. And then for like the cultural context, we need to really, again, emphasizing that paradigm. We are different, we think differently, our approaches to management, and I hate the word management because I don't like thinking about managing my family because these are familial relationships. We have a responsibility to care for them. And there's been really beautiful examples for the Maori. Love the Maoris. They've done such great work and asserted themselves in such beautiful ways in New Zealand. And there's various ways that TEK has been introduced into that conversation. And I really, really appreciate it. And then even for like my own people and other communities that use Black ash, there's been gatherings and we've brought together our knowledge and trying to address emerald ash borer as an invasive species. And we see this really beautiful approach that's developed. Has it been super successful? Not really, but you know, things take time and we got to work as hard as we can to make sure relationships are healthy and that we take these plans and we put them into action. And I think one of the ones that I was really intrigued by was the Muscalero Apaches, and the Douglas fir is threatened in their area, and it's really important to their coming of age ceremony. And so the loss of something like that from their landscape and their accessibility can have dramatic impacts in a really holistic way. And so, you know, I tried to rush through that. I did a lot of research, so I was trying to like boil down a lot of things. But for me, the aspects of Indigenous forest stewardship is, remember, Indigenous people are diverse with diverse relationships with land. Context specificity is essential in global and local mechanisms for forest stewardship. If you aren't engaging, you aren't listening, then I don't think the approaches are going to be effective. And then really what comes out of this is like bringing in this multiple sectorial collaboration energy, is that it becomes participatory and it's not transactional. I hate the idea of things just being transactional. This is a project, we're gonna get in there, we're gonna do this, and then we never see the end of it. Did the Indigenous knowledge get incorporated? Was it meaningful? Sort of conversations like that. And with the cultural context, you get an insight into how Indigenous minds are working, what our values look like, our land-based knowledge is, this TEK we love to talk about. These are where Indigenous knowledge systems live. It's all about relationships. And at least for me, like this is just for like Akwesasne, because I really focus for my community on my community. And I'm just glad I get to do this work and have these conversations. Now, the last piece that I kind of wanted to throw out there, and this is one of my favorite pieces of artwork, and it resides in a really kind of scandalous, an ironic place. So if you go through the United States Border Agency and you get pulled in, this piece of artwork is up there. And so it's based on the Tura Wampum, but it's also based on the three shores of Akwesasne. So there's a southern shore, then what you'll see is the southern shore on the bottom with the United States. Then in the middle, you'll see the shore of Cornwall Island, and on the other shore of Cornwall Island, and then that's the shoreline of Cornwall. And so what I really kind of wanted to have a conversation about is like shorelines. I'm not an expert in shorelines, but my community knows our waters, knows our shorelines. And so I'm engaging with them to understand what that means. What do we do? What do we need to be planting? Exactly what Yannick was doing in Fiji is something I'm trying to do with my own people, and understand that. I'm still unpacking a lot of literature. Henry Licker has talked about this amazing report that resisted the seaway development and the dams, which are going to affect our wheat beds, and they are. And then also the erosion that comes from the seaway. How is that impacting our communities? And then thinking about the ecology shifts that have happened. How are more islands more susceptible to erosion? Like, one of the islands I'm constantly inundated with information about is Yellow Island, which had about 15 feet of land lost just last year. And that's hard. I don't even have a full plan yet. I don't even know where we're going to get the funding for that. But I know my community is going to come up with a strategy, and we're going to do this together, by us and for us, that incorporates so much of our knowledge, because that is where there's rich sources of clay in that area that we use for our pottery. And there's been a huge push recently, or over the last couple of decades, to reclaim that practice. And there's knowledge in those teachings, there's knowledge in those pieces. So I guess I definitely went over my time. I had a lot to say, but thank you so much. Let me stop that.
Wonderful. Abraham, thank you so much. Yannick, thank you so much. So I know we've got a little bit of time, so I'm going to be really quick to kind of stitch everything together. I'm going to just pull out my notebook here 1 second. So Yannick, really quickly, what's the value of having every single person in terms of societies like levels at the table of decision making? What's the effect when we leave out certain demographics of society from the decisions that are going to be put forward? And what do the people look like when they're left behind?
Oh, big question to start off with.
Kind of.
Perfect. I mean, everyone has a different perspective, right, of these issues, and so everyone's got something different to contribute. Whenever you've got big projects that have a variety of stakeholders involved, everyone has their own agendas, their own, set of things that they're trying to achieve, and it's complicated, right? You've got all these different tiers, but that's great, but that's why, partnerships and collaborations, open communication and transparency are integral to make these relationships work. If you don't have everyone seated at the table, then you're going to have gaps in the project and in the outcomes. There's certain things that will not be addressed. So
wonderful. Thank you for that piece. I'm going to tie it together in just a second. Abe, looking at my notes here, history repeating itself. So when we look at the observation of Indigenous people, first people that have been here and have held a long relationship with their land, And then when we transpose ourselves forward in time and see the effect of ignoring such groups of people, I take, for example, this wonderful article that Yannick has read, and also Abraham, you've seen. It's about Comox, British Columbia. And it's this puzzle of these wood pieces that are set in a certain kind of configuration. And they couldn't understand archaeologically what it was for. It was set about 1,300 years ago. And a undergraduate student has determined that it was a fish farm of Indigenous knowledge. And so when we look at the fish farming practices that are taking place, and in terms of the disease, and in terms of the billions and billions of dollars of the industry's worth, if we had carried forward that kind of Indigenous knowledge or that kind of traditional ecological knowledge as a Canadian nation, we would be trendsetters. We'd be leaders in sustainable fish farming. I'm not saying that fish need to be harvested and that's their only existence, but when we look at the amount of money that is lost, but we also look at the amount of people that have been left out of the process, had we just looked at and accepted and added it to our culture and then exported that out, the fisheries would be in a better position. Ecologically, we'd all be better, but also in terms of money, like you said, Abe, Canada would be in a better position. So let me stitch this all together. As a Cornwall citizen, living here with the limited knowledge that I have, how important is it for me as an everyday citizen to be aware of what's going on, have knowledge of how to relate to the land that's around me, and what happens if I don't come to the table and participate in these conversations? What could a future look like if certain segments of the population are ignored or not invited to these conversations? In short, if the average Cornwall and area citizen is not coming forward to these conversations, what could a future without their voice look like?
Well, I guess from my perspective, a lot of this comes down, like when I think about what you're talking about, the system, the municipal system in Cornwall, the mayors, the policies, all of that work that's being done. If we're not listening or understanding the communities that are just located right next to each other, then we're going to put policies and practices into place that aren't going to be sustainable in the long-term sense. So you brought up the fisheries aspect of things. Look, like fisheries aspect of things, like Indigenous people have been vocalizing for a very long time and just not being heard. The Micmac issue, that is going on, continues to go on, where there's boats being burnt because the Micmacs are asserting their rights. We're basically fighting for our rights at this point, let alone like our voices to be heard and our knowledge to be understood and meaningfully engaged. So I guess like in a lot of ways, we see the consequences in different places where certain areas are more susceptible to forest fires. We see this in California. We're seeing this in British Columbia. There's different mechanisms that we had in place for caring for these lands that would help us to address those issues. But because we're not meaningfully engaged, we're seeing the impacts of those things. I recently just watched a documentary about, the West and how, the removal of the grasses had a huge impact. The absence of the buffalo had a huge impact, and turning this into an agricultural landscape. And we're seeing desertification. We're seeing huge, the impacts are massive, and the impacts on the land are huge. And so I often come back to this place in Akwesasne, thinking about our forest management strategies. What is it going to look like in the long term? And this is where something I really haven't fully clarified for myself. How do I work appropriately with, I guess, Canadians? How do I work appropriately? How do we reach across these boundaries to create these beautiful, to create a beautiful collaboration space of intellectual, diversity and addressing these issues? Remember that, Mohawk people don't vote in these systems. We're not a part of that. We have our own system that we work in, and we work in our communities. Now, breaking down those boundaries and working together is going to be challenging and listening, and it takes time. But again, just kind of coming back is we see the impacts of this, but also being patient with us as well. We are reclaiming these relationships. We were traumatically impacted by by colonization, residential schools. This is a lived reality that we have. Our knowledge was stolen from us. And so the understanding that like we aren't even at, I don't even think we're fully at that point of sharing our knowledge in this meaningful way. I think that there's a lot of relationship and healing that needs to happen as we continue to uncover more babies and children that were stolen from communities. Then we're going to start getting somewhere, I think, you know, and I've talked about this before, about how I'm sort of struggling to think about working with the Canadian government in these things. And, you know, I'm really excited for the 2 billion tree initiative in Canada, but like, I'm really kind of careful in that. Like, are they going to properly listen to us? Are they going to meaningfully engage us? Are they going to adjust their stuff to the local context? So we're creating this sustainable structure that is able to have sustainability across time, that Indigenous people's knowledge is a part of. And it's not just about like biomass and board footage and, you know, how much is this tree going to cost and how's this going to benefit this industry, you know, like there's deeper levels of connections. And I think if anything, I'm hoping to create that connection for Canadians at some point, you know, a connection that's deeper, that that tree is not just a tree, it's part of your family, and that you make decisions about what you're going to do with that tree in the long term as a family member, you know?
Yeah.
So that's something that I guess I have to offer. A very roundabout way of describing this. And I think I rambled on for a minute there, but I hope I answered your question.
Ramble away, my friend. So this is good. So now I believe it's time to open up the floor to questions. To those in the audience, please be patient as we move through these questions. In the meantime, Yannick and Abe, thank you so much for the conversation thus far. I do know that I've got a few questions lined up, so give me one moment to go through this. I am starting with an anonymous attendee. Can Abraham, this is a two-part question, so and take your time, there's no rush. Can Abraham detail his experiences with forest management in Upper New York State, Eastern Ontario, and Western Quebec? What success and failures and the impacts on local Mohawks? Abraham, to you.
So actually, like, I think one of the greatest successes I've been a part of is through the Eastern Ontario First Nations Working Group. And so we created a healing forest in Shanley, Ontario. And it was really about like this shared space between the Algonquins and the Mohawks, and also thinking about healing the relationship between the lands and bringing together all of these different voices to have a conversation. And I think that's one of the greatest representations of creating this setting that's about sharing knowledge, about creating ceremony and connections and access to medicines for people that may not have access to those things. But you know, my next step is like, I really want to use the 2 Billion Truth Initiative to build more of that caring for the forested landscapes in Akwesasne and the surrounding areas. And that's a part of this idea that Lee McGoffey introduced me to about, oh my gosh, now I'm struggling with what it was. But it's basically about bringing together all the different voices that work within this field and sharing resources amongst each other to have a massive impact and filling in those gaps where we have them. Again, remember the fact that like I've only been working with Mohawk Council for 2 years now, and only became the official program manager in February. So I mean, my work is just really beginning, and I'm starting to really catch my stride. So I'm actually hoping to really produce way more in the coming years than, you know, like a lot of this feels very conceptual and theoretical, and I'm putting it into practice, the lessons I learned through my research. So yeah, and I work with the Eastern Ontario Model Forest pretty regularly. I sit on their board. So, you know, like there's a huge influence that emerges from the environment program at Mohawk Council of Akwesasne. I'm really appreciative of Henry Lickers and Peggy Pike Thompson and all of the knowledge that they brought into this program and that I get to help build upon.
Let me ask you, when you're referring to Dr. Lee McGaughy, are you referring to the Great River Report?
Yeah, that is one of the mechanisms.
Yannick, yay, Yannick, yay.
Because like, look, I mean, like when I'm talking about forests, and this is one of the things I got like yelled at by one of my community members, was when I was trying to talk about forests. This is sometimes where it gets a little bit like complicated for me, like when I'm describing things, is I don't get to just talk about forests. We're talking about the waters, we're talking about the medicines, we're talking about the birds, the animals. It's all a part of this interconnected system. And the way we relate to it is through that interconnected connection. So it's like, it's hard, right? So I'm really trying to help reorganize the environment program at MCA to be able to do that work and address some of these issues of sustainability from like a funding perspective, because like people got to work, people got to eat, you know, and if I want to build expertise, I got to make sure people have jobs for a long time and want to work for me for a long time, or work with me, not work for me, I hate that, work with me. So yeah, it's I'm looking forward to big things, and I hope y'all are willing to join me on this journey, and hopefully that we can do some really cool things in the coming years.
We will, my friend. I've got a part 2 to this question. I think there's 2 more questions. Yannick, sit tight. We might have one for you. The second part to the question is also for Abraham. What has changed in local forestry since the shutdown of the local pulp mill in 2006? How has this impacted local environment? Is cutting trees on a 20 to 40 year cycle much different from clear cutting a corn or soybean crop annually?
That's a big one. Honestly, I don't have an answer for you. You know, in a lot of ways, this connection with the local pulp mill closing in 2006, I wonder how it's impacted our community. But that last piece, cutting trees on a 20 to 40 year cycle, much different from clear cutting corn or soybeans crops annually. I'm struggling with that question too. You know, because the thing is, from my perspective, like we need to be in relationship with these landscapes. We have to access wood. We have to grow these trees. We have to care for these forests, and we have to do it in a sustainable way. And that's in particular why I was really connected to that agroforestry component, was because it's not just we need to go chop trees down to build our baskets, or you know, to get a sick pair of earrings like this that Carrie Hill made. And there's that balance between it. It's a reciprocal relationship. So we have to give back to that forest. We have to help support that forest. We have to be in there. We have to help. So like, there's so many pieces to it that I currently don't have the resources to implement that framework and that process. So I can't even really answer that question. And the paper mill, I'm just thankful that I don't smell like it used to.
Thank you for that answer, Yannick. I'm going to take this next question and give it to you. I do feel that as we are both colleagues of the River Institute, it might be better situated with you. And folks in the audience, if there are questions that are not going to be answered, there will be a email address made available to you, and we'll do our best to answer them behind the scenes. Now, this question comes from Jacqueline Milner. I am very concerned about our barren shorelines, the lack of natural vegetation, the tree canopy cover to support water health, our wildlife, and by extension, our own human health. I live on the Ontario side. I'm available to collaborate with others to neutralize those areas. How can I help anyone wishing to support the same issue, not only to renaturalize those shorelines, but also to keep the mature buffer that still exists? So I imagine there are shoreline programs that we have under the River Institute that you're more familiar with, Yannick. So if you can talk about some of those shoreline programs that we have, and then also keep Jacqueline Milner in mind, and we'll take her information back to the Institute and see what best use we can use. So Yannick, take it away, please.
Well, first of all, Jacqueline, that's fantastic that you're thinking of this. This is a very important issue. I know in the past I've had conversations with a few people at the River Institute with regards to, you know, warming temperature of the St. Lawrence River and needing to renaturalize these shorelines and, you know, be able to provide natural canopy cover, and how important this is to fish populations and water temperatures and an abundance of different things. So that's great that you're already thinking of this. So personally, from my standpoint, I work for the River Rapport project, and I'm running a series of workshops. And actually, we have a workshop coming up on Monday. This is unintentional promotion of this workshop. So next Monday on August 23rd, we're running a workshop with Watersheds Canada, and it is through their naturalizing natural edge program. So literally how to naturalize your shoreline. So as part of the workshop, we're going to be going with Watersheds Canada, doing a property assessment, looking at a waterfront property, assessing the property, addressing issues that they might be having, like erosion, septic tanks or whatever else. And they will be providing feedback as to how the shoreline can be naturalized. So if this would be of interest to you, I would really encourage you to actually to watch the workshop and maybe get more information. But aside from Watersheds Canada, with regards to resources, I can't elaborate more than that. So Abraham might have more information on this, but I would encourage you to maybe contact me and maybe watch the workshop, and we can get some good conversation started.
Abraham, if you wanted to add, go ahead, and then Yannick, I'll ask you a question. Go ahead.
So Jacqueline, it sounds like we need to be friends. I'm just like reading all of your comments and your questions, and that sounds like really, I love your passion for this. I think renaturalization is a beautiful process. Like, it's something that's extremely necessary for me. In a lot of ways, I see a lot of like barren, hardened shorelines, and dealing with the wave action that comes from that. People want access to their shorelines. People want a beautiful view, but in that process, they've degraded in such a powerful way and made themselves more susceptible to further erosion. And these hardened shorelines are good for maybe 20 years, 30 years. And I see somebody on here, Luke Gerard, who I think I remember very well from like the Raising region for a minute there. And he did a lot of work on shorelines. So I'm still doing my research on shorelines. A bit of it's inspired by some of the work that I've seen back then. I'm really trying to engage my community in this. In a lot of ways, what I think about the issues around shoreline erosion is a lot about how people think about their shorelines. So what I call for is for a paradigm shift and helping people understand their connection with their shoreline and building that relationship and helping foster that relationship with that shoreline. How that will look, in a lot of ways, I'm thinking about sumac as being just this really resilient species to plant to help build the biomass in that area, but also to get something in there that can sort of grab a hold of that land, and that we can work on remediating that soil so it can support other kinds of trees. But I know that there's a dimension of this, a soil content analysis. So thinking about, well, what does it look like? Is it sandy? Is it good? Is it like compact soil? So I'm not an expert in this. I'm going to be at that workshop too next Monday to learn as much as I can about this process as well, because there's just so much to be done. And then I really want to spend time with my community and thinking about the shorelines as well, and the impacts. But for us, a lot of it comes down to thinking about the seaway, the impacts the seaway has had on us, the recreational boaters in our territory that are affecting with wave action. And then I also love to bring in this wonderful dimension of climate change conversations around it. We're seeing impacts on the amount of water that comes into this area. And so with increased water flow, it's going to increase the erosion. And this is those considerations that I'm trying to put into place and bring into the conversation and put things into place that can help us hopefully address these things in the long term. Some of these things I feel like are very much unknown, like the impact of climate change on the water levels in the long-term sense. Some years we have very low levels, some years we have extremely high levels, but we're seeing these massive influxes happening in this area. And our ability to react and respond to those things is going to come down a lot to listening to people and their relationship with that landscape and how it's changed and what do we need to plant there and how are we going to plant that there? Is it even plantable in that area, considering what it may have been subjected to with hardened shorelines, riprap? There's various dimensions of this, and I'm really excited to be doing this work. It's honestly like, it's all about community engagement from my perspective. And that's what we're going to be doing.
Madame Yannick, if I can bring you back to the fold. So if you can give us information about this workshop, I will put up your email address, no problem, but is it through the River Institute page? Where can they sign up? Date, start time, what's the best way to get the best information about this workshop, please?
Yes, so our River Report website would be the best place to find this information. So it's riverreport.ca/workshops. We have all of our past workshops listed, as well as the links to those video clips, all of our upcoming workshops with the direct links to the Facebook Live events. So all of the workshops are live streamed to Facebook Live. And then once those event links no longer exist in the future, we will be creating YouTube videos of these Facebook Lives. So riverreport.ca/workshops. I'm gonna ask maybe Zach to put it in the comment section so it's easier. Perfect, it's there. Okay. Yeah, so that would be the best place to find any information. And honestly, don't ever hesitate. You can contact me and I'll respond to any questions you have.
Perfect. Thank you for that answer. I've got 2 more questions. I'm going to switch to the chat box. What looks like we've got about 1 or 2 there. So Abraham, in a very concise fashion, I want to hear you speak elegantly, no problem, but I'm going to try to keep these things small. I've got a wonderful question from the lovely Jacqueline Milner. Can Abraham detail what those wooden blocks were in his first slide made by Mr. Lazor?
I don't know if they were made by Mr. Lazor. They're a collection of tools used by Anne Mitchell. And so I borrowed the image, but also like my grandmother had a whole collection of them. And there used to be various people around Akwesasne that would create these tools for us to create our baskets. Having connected with that network to fully understand who's making these now, I actually don't even have my grandmother's anymore, but I want to learn a bit more about that. Like my grandmother and her sister used to make baskets, so I want to learn that skill myself.
You got some homework, my friend. So next question, I have it set for question for either Yannick or Abraham. Yannick, I'm going to put it down to you and probably the next one as well. Can you give an example of a problem that would not have been able to have been solved without the use of traditional ecological knowledge? What are the limits of Western knowledge with regards to solving climate issues? So you could start it off, and I'm going to ping that off to Abraham. And I believe I have 2 more final questions, and we'll let this out.
Okay, great question. So on this, I would just start off by saying, you know, for a long time, Western knowledge has been the predominant way of thinking and of going about addressing these issues, but these are global issues, right? And so they're facing everyone with not just one way of knowing, but different knowledge systems. In the last so many years, you know, finally it's come to light that these different knowledge systems themselves may be able to really contribute to these efforts. With regards to providing a specific example on an issue being addressed using traditional ecological knowledge, I mean, I can only really draw from my own experience in Fiji and the things that I observed. I know in addressing erosion issues, a lot of the times traditional ecological knowledge was being promoted, you know, the planting of mangroves because of the cultural importance, how fantastic it was in preventing erosion. However, and from another perspective, a lot of the times building a seawall was being pushed as a very modern way to address this issue. So what you see is, you know, this more Western technology aspect being pushed and trying to be implemented against this traditional knowledge system. One of them is relatively more long-term and sustainable. It's not only addressing the impacts of climate change, but also addressing climate change at its root, right? So that's the one example I can give.
A1. Brother Abe, if you'd like, you can hop in on this one, and then I'm going to separate the questions, one for Yannick, one for Abe.
I guess I struggle with like the Western, I talk about this actually a lot, like the way that Western science as a field has been developed, and how it treats Indigenous knowledge systems in general, that it's lesser than. and that Western science has to validate our knowledge and our connection to these relationships that we have. And honestly, like, I think so much about the St. Lawrence, and I think about this place we have here, and so many issues that we've inherited because Western science wanted to control and implement different mechanisms for controlling sea level or controlling water levels. And there really isn't very much control that can be implemented. And it's hard. It's hard to really kind of like speak about this. Some of the examples I gave about addressing climate change did come from like the Nawubi and out west. And we're seeing some interesting stuff being done in California. We're doing things here in Akwesasne in a different way. You know, some of these issues ultimately are sort of precluded by these conversations about how the fact that like we need to be properly heard in the conversation, and that we need to heal these relationships in order for them to actually do something about it. Yeah, I guess like that's from my perspective. Like, I don't know how many great examples I can provide because it really hasn't been fully researched as much as it should have. It's only been within the last maybe 10 to 15 years that I've been really seeing Indigenous knowledge being respected. You know, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People didn't get signed until I think it was 2014, 2012. So like things are changing now. Indigenous people are asserting themselves, and that we're seeing more we're going to see more opportunities to build and to learn lessons. But a lot of it for me comes back to that relational network and changing people's minds about how we choose to care for the land.
Beautiful answer, both of you. And so it seems that people are really engaged and excited. So I'm going to do my best, guys. So Jacqueline Miller, to Yannick, do you think lobbying our municipal or provincial representatives would be a good idea to initiate policy? The buffers are kept along waterways. And so I will preface this conversation, or this answer rather, from your own personal perspective and not as the official representative of the River Institute.
Yeah, this is a difficult question to answer because I'm not actually very aware of what currently is being done at the municipal or provincial level with regards to initiating policy. I do know that, you know, individual relationships with waterways and people's waterfronts is very personal to them. And so I don't know if this would be the best approach. But I do know, you know, the city of Cornwall has just implemented a sustainability department, which is fantastic. And there's a lot of really great work underway. We have a couple not-for-profit organizations throughout the city who are, you know, initiating these actions to try and improve waterways. So there are quite a few things already occurring, but I don't think I can speak directly to that question. So I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you, Yannick. Abraham, I've got a question for you from a fellow by the name of John Towndrow. And I might have answered if you were scrolling through the chats, but I'm going to put it to you anyways in case you haven't. Would you say that there is an overall vision for the future of Cornwall Island in the face of the foreseeable changes due to climate change?
We ain't got a plan yet. That's basically where I'm at with it right now. It's just figuring out a plan. A lot of it for me is about long-term monitoring, getting those pieces in place, but also putting in, doing a lot of education, creating legislation in Akwesasne, because we do have our own laws here, and enforcement. What is that going to look like for us in Akwesasne? So for me, like we're in a lot of planning. I'm just doing a lot of research and planning at this point. And it feels like we're really under the gun, you know, with these time clocks that have been set in place of how we're going to be able to adjust. All I can say is I'm just doing the best I can. I'm like one person. I have an amazing team of people that are working as hard as they possibly can. I know the River Institute is working as hard as they possibly can. And even though these have just become, it feels like there's just so much more energy behind these things these days. Things are going to take a bit of time before we're really ready to address these larger issues. And trying to meet my community where they are and what they've been affected by, because I'm also bringing in the realities of what we address, what we are living with here. And I think I added a lot of clarity to that in my previous presentation on climate change in Akwesasne. And a lot of it is just reclaiming everything, reclaiming and expressing ourselves as unapologetic Akwesaslono people, and understanding that like our connections and our relationships are important. And I know it's like very high level, very political of me, but like remember too, I am a scientist, and these are the things that like I want to see research done on. I want to see implemented in a very practical, pragmatic way.
Thank you for that response, Abe. And so what I'm going to do is the last two questions, I'm going to say them at the same time, but I'm going to split them up. And so when the last person is done speaking, the next person can answer, and then we'll close this out. But I think the questions are still coming, guys. So if you're willing to stick around, we can keep talking, or we can answer them in another way. So Yannick, interestingly enough, it might be a limited answer, but I'm still going to provide it to you out of respect. Yannick, what more can we do to support those in Fiji to help with difficult weather, floods, etc.? Can we support them in any way here? Thank you.
Okay, that's a fantastic question. So I know oftentimes with response to, providing help in other countries and in different ways, the solutions are often fiscal, right? Like, let's just throw money at it and hope that something happens. I know that there are different organizations and projects in which could really use funding, and those are resources I'm actually quite keen to look more into. But I think probably the best thing that we could do would be to look at our own practices, everyday practices and contributions to climate change, our carbon footprint, because, globalized countries, the global north, we're the ones who are emitting and contributing the most to climate change impacts, just, through everyday practices, the way that we consume every day. And so I think really the best thing we could do is just be to try and, get outside, get to know your local environment, and, do whatever you can to change your everyday practices to live more sustainably. And the butterfly effect will have really good impacts. Yeah, I guess that's all I'll say on that.
Thank you for that response and that answer. Now, Abraham, to you, my friend, someone mentioned increased water temperature in the St. Lawrence. As far as I know, over the last 60 years, the average temperature through the powerhouse has peaked at 71 degrees Fahrenheit the first week in August. Has this changed?
I do not know.
It's a very specific. Okay, we'll carry that over. We'll figure that out. But thank you for being honest. Oh, Yannick, you got your hand up?
I do know like water temperatures are increasing basically from the research that we've been doing through the FENS project. And that only began back in like 2015. Like we are seeing these impacts. We are seeing them across. We're seeing the impacts. The work is being done. I didn't know about the temperatures in the powerhouse. But there's other research that I've been accessing that's sort of indicating that we are seeing a water temperature increase. The exact numbers around that, I don't have those available on hand of what the increases look like. But definitely is, now I want to know. And so I'm going to go find out.
Thank you for that answer. Okay, so my last question, it seems like this one's going to be opened up to everyone. So the time scale and extent of challenges of current climate change go way beyond even the deep history of our Indigenous peoples. What can those peoples bring to the conversation? Yeah, I read it twice backwards too. It's a deep question. I can feign an answer, but I'm going to let the respective individuals, contribute their answers. And again, none of us here are like omnipotent, and what we say is declared as like universal law. We're just people that have information, and our information may not satisfy all questions, and I'm okay with that. But it's good. It's good. So the question again, the time scale and extent of challenges of current climate change go way beyond even the deep history of our Indigenous peoples. What can those people bring to the conversation? So I'm going to step back for a second and I'm going to look at this and say, yes, the effects of climate change are huge. They're like, it won't be a simple, ceremony is beautiful, but like even like the power of a culture is not going to reverse all of the things that we've put into our environment. But as far as, for example, I learned that goldenrod, when it's in full bloom, is a indication that fall is around the corner. Um, Knowing things like that come from people that are not me, that helps me have a relationship with the signs and the patterns of nature. And so when those signs and patterns go off based on my experience, I can say, well, there's something off there and there has to be a conversation. So for me, it's just that they are the guides. They've been here before. They can tell me. They're the canaries in the coal mine. So for me, their information is, it's important. They should bring everything, all pieces of information in as far as a solution for climate change should come to the table. So their history is longer than my birth and citizenship in Canada. And I do feel that whatever they bring to the table is going to be way more valuable than whatever it is that I learned in my small period of time. But that's me personally.
I mean, look, I see climate change as an impact of, I mean, I have many like ideas about this, and this is a really well discussed subject on the roots of climate change and where it emerges from. And I really don't have an appropriate response for this question. You know, what I'm talking about is Indigenous people have a relationship with land, and that we've been in relationship and watched the cycles that have occurred across generations. What we're seeing is an increased occurrence of these cycles. So we understood these systems to have actually occur on like 100-year cycle, maybe 50 years, maybe 20-year cycles with flooding, with fires. But because of climate change, now those timescales are changing. What we're asking for, or what we're seeing, is a phenological indicator changes that are occurring as well. Now, this is research that has been done by Dr. Karim Ali Kassam, and that an ecological calendar could be implemented to be adjusted to see some of the ways in which climate change has affected the land, affected our relationships. But I don't know, like in a lot of ways, what we see is a disproportionate impact of the majority money holders in the world having impacts on the climate and being one of the greatest carbon emitters. We know which companies of the 100, like there was like 100 companies that are emitting such massive amounts of carbon into the system that are affecting climate change. It's not to say that there isn't an importance on the local level and on like the individual level to address climate change, but there's also these systemic issues that have continued across time and have connections all the way back to colonialism, and the way that the rich or those in power were able to exploit humans, exploit lands and resources, and benefit from those systems. So unless we deconstruct those systems, then I don't really know if we're going to be really able to even impact those. So I think the current system in which we exist is not going to be able to address climate change. I honestly, like, I'm looking for something that like Indigenous people can do. And I believe in a lot of ways that you know what, I don't even want to say believe, I know these are things that like my people have worked on and are reclaiming, and that we are reconnecting, and we're doing this. I'm not asking for any permission. And so I guess in a lot of ways, like, if people aren't interested in what Indigenous people have to offer to this conversation, or aren't going to respect Indigenous people's knowledge, then that's your business. So thank you.
Abe, thank you so much. So Yannick, I'm going to reposition this question and then we're going to let everybody go. So the time, scale, and extent of climate change challenges of current climate change go way beyond even the deep history of our Indigenous peoples. What can those peoples bring to the conversation? And I immediately think of Burras. And so I remember in our preliminary conversation, you said that like these Indigenous structures, these old traditionally based constructed domiciles, these dwellings, actually resist tornado and hurricanes better than, say, a modernly constructed kind of dwelling system. So when I think about it through that lens, like we could spend $100,000 on a new house that is hurricane ready and all that stuff. But if you just had a conversation and implemented proper regulations around this kind of behavior, the cost of production are very, very low, and the long-term benefit is actually greater. So through that question, through perspective to you, how long can a bure last?
Yeah, that's great, because I went over the bureaus pretty relatively quickly in my presentation, but there's just like a lot of information on these. So these bureaus were, this form of housing has been developed, and it's an architecture which has been developed over thousands of years and improved, trying different methods, what works, what doesn't. And through thousands of years of these populations being there and making improvements is what contributed to like achieving infrastructure which was able to withstand these strong weather surges. Because prior to climate change, the way that where Fiji is located geographically, it's just very prone to cyclones and to extreme weather events. Now they're just happening more often and they're more intense. But so these bureaus were created to withstand these extreme weather events. All of that knowledge was removed as soon as British settlers arrived, and now there's these colonial constructs which remain, in which everyone inhabits. The photos I actually shared were not even of lived-in bureaus; those were just for show. They had been there for a long time, and they were just to show tourists what Fijians used to live in. And the community actually lived beside these bureaus. And I was reading an article recently talking about how now within Fiji, they're actually organizing a series of workshops to relearn this knowledge, to try and regain this knowledge system, and to reconnect in the technologies and the architect used to construct these. And, in doing that, you're not only just relearning how to build something, but you're also like taking back a part of your culture that was lost. You build something over thousands of years, and then one day it's just gone. Like that's terrible. So, yeah.
Thank you for that. Okay, so I think we've gotten to the bottom. There are a lot of thank yous. I want to let you guys know that you guys hold the record for the longest town hall. Whoop-de-whoop. Next time I'm going to put on some flippy flops. So on behalf of future climate leaders, the River Institute, Abraham Francis, thank you so much for joining us today. Yannick Rosan, thank you so much for being brave and bringing your information and knowledge to the front so that we can understand things better. A mighty thanks to ZZ Top in the back doing the technical work for this webinar. We are going to move ourselves over into a quiet space and have a decompressing conversation. All of this information is going to be available on Future Climate Leaders. We invite you to set up for the next one for September 14th. And other than that, you are all appreciated for making the time today. We look forward to the next one. And actually, before I go, our website will be available. There are workshops that are on the horizon. So we ask you to keep doing this. This conversation is not meant to solve all problems concerning climate change everywhere, but what it's meant to do is begin the habit and behavior of being aware of what's going on in your community and being available to what will be coming next. And so you'll be a part of the solutions in the future. So thank you very much for your time and attention today. And other than that, this town hall was dedicated to Louis Savard. Wishing you all the best, my friend, and all you folks at home, you guys take care. Have a great night. Thank you.